Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Now, I hope at this point that everybody listening or watching on YouTube to this show has checked out the 4-part documentary series titled Let Us Pray, which is streaming on Max. If you haven't, you need to because it features some incredible stories from brave survivors of abuse within the independent fundamental Baptist movement. And one of the central figures in the series is Ruthy Heiler. She's one of the co-founders of the Blind Eye Movement, a movement that is seeking to equip other survivors like Ruthy, and she is also someone who put her own abuser behind bars. When we recorded our first interview, which released a couple weeks ago, that interview was recorded about a year and a half ago. Ruthy was in the midst of an ongoing legal battle for justice against her abuser, Aaron Willand. If you've watched the series Let Us Pray, then you know that Aaron Willand is now behind bars for 11 to 40 years. The interview you're going to hear today was recorded after the sentencing was passed, but before the release of Let Us Pray, about exactly 1 week before Let Us Pray premiered on Investigation Discovery. So in the conversation, neither Ruthy or I had seen the series yet, but we're going to talk a little bit about what we were hoping the series would be, and I think it met a lot of those hopes and dreams for the series. And we also talk about some of the biggest concerns and fears of these stories being shown on a large scale. Ruthy also reflects on the experience of putting her abuser behind bars, her current advocacy work, and what life is like now. This is a really powerful look at Ruthy's story. It's by no means a deep dive into every aspect of her case. For that, I would defer you to Let Us Pray. But Ruthy really opens up here, and I had a really good time reconnecting with her almost a year after a previous interview. So please enjoy this conversation with Ruthy Heiler. I definitely want to talk with her at some point about her overall thoughts on the series now that we've both seen it, but maybe that'll be a part 3. We'll have to see. But for now, enjoy part 2 of my conversation with Ruthy Heiler. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Ruthy, we are reunited again, like our annual check-in.
Annual check. Yeah. Has it been a year?
Yeah, it's been a little over a year. I think it was October. I should have wrote the date down. I think it was like October of 2022 that we met. Or no, it was April of 2022. So it's been like a year and a half. And then we filmed again in was it October that we were in Michigan?
Yes.
Yeah, October 14th.
Mm-hmm.
So, man, that is crazy. So the first time that we met was literally shooting for this documentary series. And it was probably the most awkward way to meet anybody ever because I don't think we ever talked. Like, I was aware of you and I had seen some of your stuff, but I don't think we'd ever like communicated at all until like that day. And it was like, you're interviewing Ruthy. She's coming in now and we're rolling. Go.
Yeah. That was kind of how it was with meeting everybody involved in the series. Was we want to capture the introduction on film. So don't reach out to them. And I'm like, I am kind of introverted. So this is the most awkward meeting of people ever. So it was and you have cameras in your face and you're already uncomfortable. So it's very weird.
Well, I think so that day, because that was it was April of 2022. So like that day I had done my filming day. Like, so it was like whatever, 8 o'clock in the morning till I think like 4. And then and they were just interviewing. It was like 3-hour interview. And then there was like a couple more hours of showing them stuff and talking about it. And then I think your flight got in late or something. And so like you got in there like I think it was like 5 or 6. And then we interviewed for 2 hours. And then for anybody hasn't seen any of this, like it was literally like a room that was like the size of a closet with like 3 massive cameras, like or 1 massive camera, 3 people, like just right in our face, like where my hand is. It was like right there. And they're like, okay, meet, act natural, do your show. And then midway through, like then I'm getting direction of like, can you ask it again this way? And it was such a weird shake up from just being on Zoom or like Riverside and just talking. But we did it. We survived. So going back to that time, like I didn't remember anything we talked about, like, because it was such a weird situation. And when I was listening to it again a few weeks ago now, listening to our conversation, hearing the story, like it was so interesting kind of getting back into the headspace of that time period And you were at that point talking about, I'm nervous. I don't know when the next, trial date's going to be. I'm emailing back and forth. Like, it was a lot of frustration about just being stalled in the legal process. Do you recall like kind of the feeling of that time period and like what was going through your mind as we're sitting down to do this? You're shooting and telling your story while also your story is not done. You're still in a very
Right.
frustrating chapter. Like, what were you feeling at that point?
Yeah, it just like overwhelmed and kind of questioning if I did the right thing. I'm like, I was expecting to go through a trial, court, something. But when he gets arrested and then it's over 2 years later and you don't have any answers, you don't know like what the next step is, what the process is going to be like. It was definitely very, like, I felt defeated in a way.
Yeah.
Especially with the little bit of communication we were getting. And it was kind of almost like, we'll let you know when something new happens,
Right.
kind of leave us alone. And I would check in like probably every 3 to 6 months. So it was just getting really frustrating at that point. And I remember when we were talking, like just feeling like defeated to the point of, if nothing happens, I guess nothing happens at that
Sure.
point. So it was definitely frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely like I got this sense just hearing your story and hearing hundreds of stories that have gone through this process is like that re-traumatization of going through the legal process where it's like and I've heard some survivors say, I don't know if this would be your sentiment too. I've heard some survivors say it's more traumatizing than the initial abuse at times because it's so drawn out and it's so public and there's so much, back and forth. And, obviously you have people that are turning on you or feel like you're being abandoned by certain people. It's just a really lengthy and hard process. And I got that sense from our conversation with you waiting. And then later, months later, we're sitting in a courtroom in Michigan. And it's like, it's such a cold feeling environment where it's like, yes, this is justice, but it feels so wrong still. Like this doesn't feel right. And I guess from your experience now, hindsight being 2020, like what do you wish was different? And I'm sure it's a long answer. What do you wish was different about how the legal system and the press deals with survivors who are going through that lengthy process?
So COVID definitely didn't help,
Yeah,
but just
right.
the fact of more communication. There just wasn't a lot of communication as far as, even just that I know you're waiting to hear something, kind of a positive, keep your head up. We're still working on this, any kind of communication. And it just wasn't really there. It was me as the victim reaching out to where I felt like I was a pest. So
Right.
it was just unfortunate. But ultimately, I felt like too that a lot of this should have been done back when I was younger. So I just felt like we did everything right by reporting everything back
Right.
in like 2006, 2005, not realizing that he could still be charged in Michigan. And so when I did do the article with Sarah Smith, I didn't know that there was any possibility of charges, which, I'm glad I did, but it definitely tore open the wound all over again. I still felt like that vulnerable, 14, 15-year-old going through all of it the first time. And then to have, it drawn out so long, it was definitely very harmful in a way to my mental health. And I just felt almost, what's the word I'm looking for? It put me back in that feeling of not being worthy of like protection that the IFP puts over you. But this time it was by, the court situation. It was just,
Yeah.
it was hard for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've already been betrayed so much by authority in that sector. And then it's like, then you step into the group that's supposed to like swoop in and save the day, and it's a lot of the same treatment. And I think, I think that's an unfortunate thing. um one of the things, like I mentioned, your story was very public, got a lot of press coverage, and obviously, I mean, there's a series sometime around when this comes out that's heavily featuring your story. And one of the things that you told me was that you wanted to share your story because other people were sharing your story, and you wanted to make sure it was told from your voice. And it's a scary thing. You go into a docuseries, and at the end of the day, there's an editor. And you go into a newspaper, at the end of the day, there's an editor and a journalist putting a story together. And so it's hard to have control over your own story. For you, with all of these things looming, with probably more coverage on the way, more people like looking into your story, if there's like one key takeaway from your story that you would hope people would have, what is it, and what are you hoping to see come about from your story being shared?
Yeah, so it's a lot. Like I told you, I'm a pretty private person. I came forward and talked to Sarah Smith about this because back when I tried to be vocal when I was younger, I kind of got silenced. And I felt like if anybody could read my story and hear me tell what happened to me, it would be almost healing in a way, that I get to tell it from my own voice. And it wasn't just rumor. Everyone had rumors when I left the church.
Sure.
And things like that. So I decided to talk about it. And at first it was kind of just to be healing and to warn others, because I knew that the pastor from that church was still, an authority. And I was concerned that, this could happen again because my abuse was covered up. And so I also did it for that reason, and for the fact that I kind of had a suspicion that my abuser had other victims. I knew of 2 at the time that I spoke up. So I just kind of had this nagging feeling that there's more. And I still to this day feel like there's more. So I guess it's multiple answers to your question, but mainly for my own, like to be able to tell my story, to help any other victims that there potentially were, for not only from my abuser, but from the church covering up abuse. So yeah, I just thought it was very important to speak out about it. And yeah, I'm sorry, I don't remember the other question.
No, it was really just what you just said, which is what was the main hope going into this, because I think that's like I said, with newspapers, with that, and it is too one of those things where you mentioned Sarah Smith, like, I think of her article, or I think of, the recent book from Sarah Stankorb, who's another great reporter. And there's some reporters I feel are very callous and are going for the most clickbait parts of these stories, the more true crime or egregious angles. And one of the things that's really just bothered me lately is like I don't feel like there's a victim focus in these stories, and like what the victim wants to accomplish in having their story told. I think a lot of times the focus is what will generate our network the most money, or our website the most clicks, and usually that's the most harmful, damaging, painful, traumatizing parts of these stories. And there's a balance there, because they're businesses, and they need to get clicks and need to get views. But also, I think sometimes the humanity of the story gets lost, to where, sitting in the courtroom in Michigan, for me, that was sitting there for me. It added another layer to this whole conversation, because I had never read an article or done an interview or done anything up to that point that could really communicate the feeling of sitting in a courtroom with people who are wondering, like, how does this day end? And for me, it was a very changing experience. And I think for anybody who can, I mean, one, to be supportive, I think you should go attend and support in situations like that. But just to get a sense of like what the process is actually like, I think is very important. Um, for press specifically, how do you think that reporters, journalists, podcasters like myself, like, how do you think that we can do a better job of asking questions, communicating the story while also not re-traumatizing the person that we're talking to, or just being harmful, and I would say even like accidentally harmful, like where something said that just it's not helpful in the
Right.
conversation.
So after Sarah Smith's article, things kind of snowballed, and I had other articles coming out that were written by journalists that had never even spoken to me. So
Wow.
they just kind of pulled from her story and then talked to another person, but never actually spoke to me. And so a lot of the stuff that was put in there wasn't even factual. So then, you already have people that have their negative things to say, and then they're reading these other articles that didn't even come from my personal experience. They just came from wherever they could find information. And then it just kind of fueled the fire of all of these people that were saying negative things like, oh, this contradicts what you're saying. And it's like,
Mhm.
because I didn't say that. So
Yeah.
I think it's very important if you're going to write a story, especially about a victim, that you actually speak directly to the victim and get it from their own, mouth. Don't just pull pieces. That was one of the most frustrating things for me, is seeing things in black and white that wasn't actually factual. It was
Hmm.
not true. So like even minor things like my age was wrong, but that
Right.
can harm a case when you're going to court because you have people reading all of this information. It's not accurate. And then it kind of puts this dark cloud over you of like, is she telling the truth? Because this
Hmm.
journalist wrote this. And it's like, but that didn't come from me.
Right. I'm curious. You mentioned some of the things that were said that weren't true, and I mean, are there any things that were like commonly said that you want to address, or like that you know anything that people were running with as being fact that wasn't, that to this day you feel is kind of like a long-standing myth about your story?
I think a lot of it had to do with just um, like my age when things happened,
Sure.
things like that. Because my story's kind of split in two, where I had the same abuser, but it was two different situations, two different times, I guess. So once it happened when I was uh, 12, and then the other time it happened when I was 14. So, and he had moved to a different state. It was in two different states when this happened. So I think a lot of people were confused about that just by the way it was written. It didn't um, completely cover that whole situation. So it was very confusing for people to read. And I understand it would be confusing. Um, but I think that was one of the main things. The rest were just like small, minor things. Like I said, like my age. Um, it said that I was abused on church property. I personally was never abused on church
Mm.
property. It all occurred at his home. So there were little things like that. I'm talking about in Michigan.
Right.
Um, Now in Washington, that was a different situation, but in Michigan, it never happened on the church property. Now other victims, it did, but in my situation it didn't. So there's just little things like that that were in there that weren't accurate.
Right. Right. Yeah, there's yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the age thing, because I think that's something that people tend not to realize is a big deal, but especially when it comes to charges like, there's a case recently that I've been following, and there was a lot of conversation about age, and it's like the
Mhm.
severity of the charge changes drastically,
Yes.
like when you get into the 14 and under, I think is, and then like, or 12 and under, or 15 or old, like it can
Mhm.
change the sentence drastically, and the whole like everything can change just off of that. And I think sometimes people get stuck on like, which is true in a sense, people will go, it doesn't matter what age they were, it's terrible that that happened, which is true, but it can affect what can be done to the person who was
Definitely.
committing the abuse. think that's important.
And to go off of that, like when I was in Washington, which he was charged for that first, I was 14 and I was there for like 2 weeks, and it was repeated um, abuse, like daily. And he received 5 years and he only served 3. Now in Michigan, I was 12 and it wasn't as much. I don't want to like label types of abuse, but it wasn't as severe in my mind. But he received 40 to life, so, because I was 12. So that goes to show exactly what you just said. Like age does have a big, hand in how much time they receive and things like that.
Right, right. Well, let's talk about that because you mentioned, Michigan and Washington, and I think one of the things that's been a confusion point is, you know, he was sentenced twice, like once early on and then once, just recently, a year ago. And some people were going, why is he getting sentenced twice? Why is he, and some people I think extremely wrongfully so are going, why are you still talking about it if he served a sentence, which I mean, I don't know what to even say to those people that I can say on a podcast that won't get clipped a million different ways. Um, but can you explain that for people just as far as like what each of these cases were for and like why there were 2 different court cases, 2 different sentencings?
Basically, when I reported my abuse, I reported all of it from 12 to 14. Everything that occurred, I reported it to, with my mom, to the Michigan police. Now, at the time, the way that they explained it to my mom, because she was more involved than I was, just because I was so young, I was 15. The way they explained it to her was that Washington was the more severe crime. Basically, he would see more time there, and not to put me or to not to put me through as much, kind of. So he pled guilty. I wrote a statement and he was sentenced in Washington, but he only was sentenced for what happened in Washington, not Michigan. But the way I understood it was, the way the law was, and I don't understand the law back then even, was that he couldn't be charged for both. It was like one or the other. But after the article was released with Sarah Smith, they looked back into things and said, well, no, he can absolutely be charged in Michigan. And because he had moved out of state, the statute of limitations had froze. So once you move out of the state, like there's no cap anymore.
Really?
Yeah, that's what I learned, that it freezes at the time that they moved. So he moved right after my abuse had occurred in 2003. So it froze at that time.
So it's a current crime basically in there.
Yes.
It's not expired. That's so, see, this is the stuff too that's like, it's one of the things you mentioned, like reaching out and finding out information and trying to, is like, there's people I think who listen to this stuff or like who hear things like that and are like, I never knew that was even a thing, or that's like, that's even an option. And like I've talked to people who literally go like, I can talk to law enforcement now. And I'm like, yes, or you can. So that's really interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that because I didn't know that, that aspect of it. So
and my situation is why, if anyone's like, well, it happened so long ago, I'm like, it does not matter.
Right.
Go to police, report it. If they can't do anything, they'll tell you. Right. But chances are, if they can, I mean, to me, it was like when they asked, do you want to press charges? I said, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Because I had heard from somebody else that he was still involved in a church in Washington. He was still around children in Washington. So to me, I was like, get him off the streets. So yes, absolutely. So I always let people know it doesn't hurt to try.
Yeah. Yeah. And it doesn't hurt to even go a couple times because law enforcement, one officer may tell you wrong information. Yep. Ask a couple, like go to a lawyer, like, and if criminal doesn't go through, there's always civil side. Like there are options available to people. I want to talk a little bit just about like the actual court process, because we were there together. I don't know, as of this recording, I don't know what's shown, what's not, if it's a couple shots from it or if it's a lot. It was a very powerful day, like I said, for me. I know 100-fold for you. Um, you know, if you're open to, I'm curious, like, what was the emotion going through your mind in that day? Like, now this is the second time seeing some form of justice for this. Like, did you feel excited, relieved, sad, scared, anxious? Like, what was the all of the above in some level? Like, what was your number one emotion, I guess, sitting there that day wondering, like, how does this come to a close?
Definitely anxious. So I told myself, because this was the first time I had seen him since 2005, when I actually was abused by him. So I had never seen him in person, even though he had gone to prison previously. I never had to go to court. I literally wrote the judge a letter for sentencing, and that was it. So this, even though now, I'm almost 32 years of age, I have to see him for the first time. So that was very hard. I was very anxious. I didn't know how I would feel when I saw him. And to have to get up and actually give a statement and everything like that, I was very, very nervous. But as soon as he walked in, it gave me the power I needed to just be like, guns a-blazing, basically. I'm going to stand up here and tell you how I feel. You're going to listen. It was very empowering. I just got like chills thinking about it. I wanted him to know exactly what he did to me and how I felt about it. But it was hard, because writing your statement, you want to be powerful, but you also want to let the judge know that this has affected your life and that you are forever changed from it. But it was hard to let the judge know that, but also I didn't want him to think he won over me.
Right.
So it was very hard to write a statement also. And then when they called and said I would actually have to testify, that was... looking back, I probably should have asked for a break or something.
Well, that was something that was totally not in the schedule.
No.
And I was trying to remember what led to it. It was just something in the statement that the lawyer for Aaron disputed, right?
Yes. So they were trying to dispute how many times it had happened, I believe. And so they wanted me to testify to the fact of how many times it had happened, basically. So that was completely a curveball. I wasn't expecting to testify at all. I was actually told I wouldn't have to, and that I'd only, they said I don't even have to give a statement, but if you'd like to, it definitely helps sentencing. And so I opted to give a statement because I wanted the judge to understand my mindset and the environment I was raised in. Also, the fact that he was a Bible teacher. Like, there were things that I wanted the judge to hear that maybe he didn't see in all the reports, because obviously you can't read all of that, or I didn't read all of that, so I don't know what the judge actually knows. So I just felt like I wanted him to hear it from me. So
no, when you were called to testify, it was like a big, like, it was a shocking moment, and it was like it just felt like it did suck the energy out of the room, where it was like, and it did it you I think you handled yourself well in all of it, in that it felt like you were empowered more than disempowered, which I think is, like you mentioned, the fear is like, does he leave, yes, going to prison, but also feeling like he ultimately defeated me. And I don't think that mood was there, and it was one of the most satisfying things ever, seeing him in handcuffs being escorted out of that room. You mentioned he had been working in another church. That was a big reason for coming forward. And Sharon, our director of the series, made a choice not to hear Aaron speak at all within the documentary, which I think is great. what's your take on that? Do you wish people could hear kind of the, hear him dig his own hole, so to speak, or do you like the idea that no one's going to hear his voice whatsoever?
Yeah. So when she said that, I liked how she worded it of, we opted to not give him a voice at all. And
Right.
I do like that. But at the same time, like you said, just some of the stuff he said in his statement was just, it was laughable. Like I remember, I think we even burst out laughing. Like I found God in prison, like just stupid things that he said. I'm like, are people actually, does he
Yeah.
actually think this sounds good?
Yeah.
So to me, it would make him look even worse. So
Yeah.
I do have it on recording though somewhere.
Yeah.
Maybe
No,
I'll
that,
really.
yeah, no, it was, I was like, oh, great. We're going to all have to leave the courtroom because the judge was like, you can't be doing that. But it was so laughable given the position he was in when he was committing the abuse to then be like, I found God as his defense is like,
Yeah. Well, you were
come
already supposed to
on.
have God as our Bible teacher.
Yeah. This time's different. This time's different.
Yeah, this
Um,
is different.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I wanted to ask you specifically about that statement because one of the things, the only reason that I was bummed about it, and I think it's the right decision overall to not let him speak.
Mhm,
But the one thing I wish that could be shared was that moment where he's, where
mhm.
they talk about, finding God and all these sorts of things. And I'm curious for you, you know, what do you think of when people like him say they found God, or you see churches, this is common. You see
Yeah.
churches where someone, maybe they served their time, they were sentenced, they, quote unquote, repented and they're now trying to change and they're coming into a new church. Like,
It
do you put any stake in any of those situations, or is it something where it's like at that point you've lost all credibility and trust?
mhm. Yeah, so it's funny you mentioned that because actually in my Facebook memories today, I was reading because there was a clip back when somebody was talking about Jack Scott was going to be released from prison and how,
Right.
they would welcome him into their church because he's just another sinner in the pews.
Oh, Bob Gray. You're no
Yeah.
better than Jack
Yes.
Hyles. Yeah. I have to
Yeah.
put that clip in here for sure.
Okay, let's just put the rubber on the road. You ready? If Jack Scott walked in here tonight and sat down, Jack Scott walked in here tonight and sat down in the pew where you're at, how would you respond? Some of you are nothing but stinking hypocrites. That's all you are. You think that cock crows because of you. What if Dave Howes walked in here tonight and sat down next to you? I don't want no whoremonger sitting next to my family. I wonder if anybody caught you late at night watching something on television you shouldn't have been watching. I'm going to tell you something. There needs to be some spirituality, spiritual minds concerning a great army of people who have fallen.
And I put a statement on our Facebook page that basically says, we all make mistakes, we all deserve forgiveness, but there's just certain people that don't deserve to be a normal part of society again, and that includes in a church. Like, you should value your parishioners and the children in your church over that one sinner. I mean, he can watch the service from his house or something, but
Yeah.
when you choose to prey on a child and break their trust in the worst way imaginable, you do not deserve to be just another sinner in the pews. You deserve to never go back, in my opinion. If I was at a church and there was a known child predator, I would leave. I would not. That just goes to show like what you allow. And yeah, I'm definitely not okay with that. He just deserves to have the mark that he's placed on his victim. When you do that, you place scars on your victims for life, and you just don't deserve to come walking waltzing back and have, everything pick up where it left off. So
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't have a bank robber be the church treasurer. Like there's certain things that just
right.
you make decisions and you have ramifications. And I guess kind of one of the last things I want to kind of talk about is, you know, you mentioned that shame and things, and I would hope now, you know, you don't feel that shame. You don't feel at all, this is the actions of somebody else. This is his actions. But it is true that those actions leave a mark in faith communities, and people tend to, for whatever reason, I would say even in society, people, because they don't want to believe someone's capable of doing truly evil things, they tend to be very forgiving and stand on the side of predators and not the people who've been harmed. Because I think it's a easier thing to swallow when it's like, I can't imagine he would do that, or that it's that bad. And so you have to kind of, they've left this mark on you where, like, again, people can turn on you. There can be a lot of people that don't stand with you. For you now, kind of moving forward, like, what's been your experience with, the people around you? Do you feel like you've been supported? Do you feel like you have a large network of people that have your back? Or do you still feel like there's a lot of people, especially maybe in past religious circles, that are like, this is partially on you and it's always going to be this thing that you have to bear? Like, how have other people kind of surrounded you at this time?
So I definitely have support from everyone that matters. So my
Right.
family, friends, loved ones, people whose opinions matter to me. I've definitely been supported there. I think the hardest thing for me was not having the support from the church and people within the church. Like you're saying, if you have these scars and just shame, and I think the reason I still somewhat carry that is because I've never received like an apology, like, you were harmed, he's wrong. It was just always my fault. And so I can move on without that support. It's hard that it's still being continued to this day in a way of, our pastor would never do that, and things like that. It makes that shame continue. So when you're supporting, people that covered up abuse or abused others, you're allowing that shame that victim is feeling to continue. And I think, although I hate to admit it, I think it will continue until there's a big change, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think you've got a good perspective, which is, and far be it for me to tell you how to feel, but I think you're right in choosing the people that matter and their opinions, especially, it's funny because I think sharing this stuff publicly or engaging in this kind of fight publicly, I think, you understand, like, everybody's got an opinion, there's always people that come out of the woodwork, and sitting here not knowing, how much that's going to amp up over the next couple of weeks, it is, I think, important to pick that support system where, like, they have your back, and, Joe Schmo on the internet doesn't matter, and Joe Schmo in the pew that truly doesn't care about you doesn't matter. I hope that's something that, you keep in mind over the next couple of weeks. And for people who feel like they're in the same boat, who've been in similar circumstances, like, I think that's great advice. Just surrounding yourself with, like, a network of people that truly care is huge. The last question I want to ask you, so much has happened in a lot of ways. Like, a lot of chapters have, like, went from being open to closing very quickly in succession, and, like, it feels like a lot is happening very quickly, or very slowly depending on the day. For you now, with advocacy, with the blind eye movement, with, like, all of the things that you've been working on, is that something you think you'll do forever? Is it something you think you might now at this point kind of step away from a little bit? And, where do you see the future as far as like continuing to work in this space?
I think I will continue to advocate for anybody that, needs it and reaches out. And I don't actively seek out victims and,
Right.
hey, I can help. But if somebody comes to me, like even in my own personal life, not even church related, that have gone through a situation and they don't know the steps or the process to seeking justice, like I like to help. And it is hard because sometimes you can get, it's having a balance of knowing when it can be too much for you personally, and making sure that you keep yourself safe in the process. So, but I think I will always kind of have a soft spot for other victims, and if they come to me and are needing help, then I will always do what I can to help. Now, am I going to make a career out of it or something like that? No, no.
Right.
I think just helping others has also helped me in a way. So it's like you're in the lifeboat now and pulling them.
Right.
It's a very preacher analogy to say, but
Yeah. No,
I learned some positive points from preachers along the way. But
yeah, it's so funny you say that. That's one of the things I've been writing a lot more, like just I think largely just for myself, but just like putting, I go on walks a lot. I talk about on the show all the time, like I go on walks because it's like where I unwind. And I've been like writing a ton of stuff just in like Google Docs or like in my notes. And I started writing about like a lot of the things that fuel me now, or like a lot of the lessons that I follow now, I learned in church.
yeah,
Like it just, because I followed those things, it put me at odds with the church. Like to stand up for what's right, to always tell the truth, to
right,
stand firm on these positions, to protect defenseless people. It's like those are all things that were taught in church that weren't acted out. And it's
right.
like the minute you do start acting those things out, the church is nowhere to be found. And so I think it would be really interesting to continue kind of writing out those things that were like those good lessons that you were taught that you're still living, that like the church actively does not like. I think it's really interesting. But
It's
look,
very true.
I appreciate you doing this and coming back on. I know that you're not a naturally extroverted person who like jumps at the idea of doing these things. If for nothing else, it was great to just reconnect and chat in a less awkward setting, hopefully. But for those that are listening who want to follow your story or want to continue seeing things from you, what's the best place for people to connect and follow kind of your story or Blind Eye Movement if you want to keep it a little bit separate?
Yeah, so we have the Blind Eye Movement Facebook page, where we post some, helpful tips, things like that. We, if you feel like you need help, you're in a situation where, you don't know what the next steps should be, just feel free to DM that page, direct message, and one of us behind the scenes will respond and do everything we can to help you. But yeah, I have my personal Facebook page. I'm just, like I said, I'm a very private person. So a lot of my stuff's pretty private, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. Well, yeah, definitely check the link in the show notes and go check out the Blind Eye Movement, and you can kind of see everything there. And I guess in this docuseries they're going to see you. So then go to HBO Max, or I guess just Max now. Go check it out. But thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. It's so nice not having massive cameras in our faces this whole time. And really look forward to chatting again in the future.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me.